It was a sunny afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood in 1991, where balloons bobbed in the gentle breeze and children's laughter echoed through the air. It was Danny's 7th birthday, a day that was supposed to be filled with cake, presents, and innocent fun. Friends from the neighborhood were running around the backyard, their faces sticky with frosting, their hands clutching paper plates piled high with treats. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and charcoal from the barbecue, and for a moment, it seemed like nothing could go wrong. But amid the laughter and games, something happened that would haunt Danny's family forever. Danny was a bright, curious boy with a mop of brown hair and a smile that could melt the coldest heart. He was the kind of kid who always wanted to explore, who would wander off to inspect a caterpillar or peer behind a tree to see if a secret world was waiting for him. That day, his mom, Karen, was busy handing out slices of cake and refilling cups of fruit punch. His dad was manning the grill, calling out for everyone to get their burgers hot and fresh. It was a scene of pure happiness until, without warning, Danny was gone. At first, it was easy to think he'd just wandered off for a moment. Kids do that. Maybe he'd gone inside to grab another juice box or was playing hide-and-seek with his friends. Karen checked behind the shed, under the deck, even in the neighbor's yard. But as minutes turned to hours, and the sun began to dip below the trees, the panic set in. Calls to Danny's name became more desperate, their voices cracking with fear. The police were called, neighbors formed search parties, and the once celebratory backyard turned into a scene of frantic searching. The days after Danny's disappearance felt like a blur. Posters with his gap-toothed smile went up on telephone poles. News crews came and went, their bright lights casting eerie glows on the darkened street. The police combed the neighborhood, the woods, every possible lead, but Danny was nowhere to be found. As weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, the laughter of that summer day was replaced by a heavy silence in the Miller household. Karen clung to hope like a lifeline, refusing to believe her boy was gone for good. Every night, she'd leave the porch light on, just in case he found his way home. Life moved on around them, but for Karen, every day felt like waiting for something she couldn't name. She kept his room the same, untouched, like a museum to the boy she hoped would walk through the door at any moment. His baseball glove still sat on the shelf. A toy dinosaur waited patiently on the windowsill. In her heart, she believed that somewhere out there, Danny was alive. 10 years later, Karen found herself at a yard sale a few towns over. She wasn't even sure why she'd stopped. Maybe it was the hope that she'd find something to fill the empty spaces of her life, or maybe it was just a way to spend a lonely Saturday morning. The yard sale was the usual mix of old books, cracked picture frames, and dusty toys that had long since been abandoned. She wandered through the rows, half distracted, until something caught her eye. It was a battered old toy box, the kind you'd see in a child's room. Its paint was chipped, and the lid was crooked, but it drew her in like a magnet. She walked over, her heart thumping in her chest for reasons she couldn't explain. There was something about it. Something that tugged at the memories she kept buried deep. She knelt down and traced her fingers along the edge of the toy box. When she opened it, a chill ran down her spine. Inside was a collection of toys that looked oddly familiar. Little cars, a stuffed bear, and a plastic dinosaur that made her breath catch in her throat. It looked just like the one Danny used to carry everywhere, the one that had been missing since that day in 1991. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It couldn't be. She felt dizzy, her mind spinning with memories and questions she didn't want to ask. The man running the yard sale noticed her standing there, frozen. He wandered over, wiping his hands on his jeans. Looking for something in particular? He asked casually, but Karen's voice caught in her throat. She could barely form the words. "Where did you get this?" she finally managed, her voice a whisper. He shrugged. "Oh, I picked up a bunch of stuff from an estate sale a few weeks back. House was being cleaned out after the owner passed." "Why?" "Something wrong." Karen's heart was pounding so loudly she could barely hear. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all she could do was clutch the toy dinosaur to her chest. It felt like holding a piece of Danny again, something solid in the middle of the emptiness that had swallowed her whole. She bought the toy box without another word, her hands shaking as she handed over the few crumpled bills she had in her pocket. The man watched her with a puzzled look but said nothing. Back in her car, Karen sat for a long moment, staring at the toy in her lap. It was like a crack had opened in the past, a small window to something she thought was lost forever. Questions flooded her mind. How did these toys end up here? Who had them all these years? And what did it mean for Danny? Was it possible he was still out there, waiting to be found? She drove home in a daze, the toy box rattling in the back seat like a ghost. When she got home, she carried it up to Danny's room, setting it down on the carpet that still smelled faintly of him. She ran her hands over the toys again, as if touching them would somehow bring him back. There was a note at the bottom of the toy box, folded and yellowed with age. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it, the words scrawled in a child's handwriting. It read, "I'm okay. Don't worry." Karen's breath caught in her throat. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, her heart thundering in her chest. What did it mean? Where had this note come from? And more importantly, where was Danny? She knew in that moment that she couldn't stop searching. There was something here, a clue, a promise that her son was still out there somewhere. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she knew she had to follow it. She had to find out what happened to Danny, no matter how long it took. As she sat there in the quiet room, the sun slipping behind the trees, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was fragile, like a single flame in the darkness, but it was there, flickering in her chest. She held the note to her heart and whispered, "I'll find you, Danny. I promise." And that's where the mystery really begins. Karen stared at the note in her hand, her fingers tracing the words over and over like they were a lifeline. "I'm okay. Don't worry." It was such a simple message, but it carried the weight of 1,000 questions. How could Danny have written it? Where had it come from? And if he was okay, why hadn't he come home? She felt the weight of all those lost years pressing down on her, but at the same time, a flicker of something she hadn't let herself feel in years, hope. She called her sister, Emily, who lived a few towns away, and told her about the yard sale, the toy box, and the note. Emily was quiet on the other end of the line, listening carefully. "Are you sure it was his?" she asked softly, not wanting to crush Karen's fragile hope. Karen closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. "I know it was. I can feel it." Emily promised to come over that evening to help her go through the rest of the toy box. Karen hung up and sat in Danny's room, the note still clutched in her hand. She looked around at the shelves lined with dusty books, the posters on the wall that had begun to fade, and the little sneakers still sitting neatly by the door. It was as if he just stepped out for a moment, but she knew better. Every detail of the room was a painful reminder of the years that had slipped through her fingers. That night, Emily arrived with a box of old family photos. "I thought maybe seeing these would help us remember," she said, her voice gentle. Karen nodded, and they spread the pictures out on the bed, snapshots of Danny grinning with chocolate ice cream smeared across his cheeks, blowing out candles on his 5th birthday, hugging his stuffed bear tied to his chest. Karen couldn't stop the tears that slipped down her cheeks. Each picture was a memory of what they had lost. Emily picked up the toy dinosaur and turned it over in her hands. "It really is his," she said, her voice low. "I remember this one. He used to take it everywhere." Karen wiped her eyes and nodded. "I don't know what this means, Em, but I can't just leave it. I need to find out where this came from." Emily squeezed her hand. "We'll figure it out. We'll find out what happened." The next day, Karen went back to the yard sale house. It was an old, 2-story place that had seen better days, its paint peeling and the grass overgrown. She knocked on the door, her heart in her throat. The man who'd sold her the toy box answered, a curious look on his face. "Back again?" he asked. Karen took a deep breath. "I need to know more about where you got those things. The toy box, the toys. Do you remember who they belonged to?" He scratched his head. "Like I said, it was an estate sale. The old woman who lived there passed away, and her family didn't want any of the stuff. I just bought the whole lot to sell off." Karen's hands shook. "Do you know the name of the woman? Or the address of the house where the sale was?" The man thought for a moment. "Yeah, let me see." He disappeared inside and came back with a crumpled receipt. "Here it is, Margaret Collins. Lived over on Oakwood Drive." Karen's mind raced. She didn't recognize the name, but maybe someone in town would. She thanked the man and walked back to her car, clutching the piece of paper like it was the key to everything. Back at home, she called the local library, hoping someone there might know more about Margaret Collins. The librarian, Mrs. Reed, had lived in town her whole life and was always a fountain of knowledge about local history. Margaret Collins, yes, I remember her, she said over the phone. She was a bit of a recluse, kept to herself mostly. No family left as far as I know. Karen's mind was spinning. If Margaret had no family, how did she end up with Danny's toys? Was it possible Danny had been there? She decided to drive out to Oakwood Drive and see the house for herself. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with tall trees that cast long shadows over the road. The house at the address was small and run down, with boarded-up windows and a faded "for sale" sign in the front yard. She parked and got out, her steps hesitant as she approached the porch. She tried the door, but it was locked. She peered through a crack in the wood, her heart pounding. The inside was dusty and empty, but she could just make out the shapes of old furniture and boxes stacked in corners. She couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in that house, there were answers waiting to be found. Karen decided to talk to the neighbors. An elderly man next door was watering his flowers when she walked up. She introduced herself and asked if he'd known Margaret. "Oh, sure," he said, leaning on his cane. Margaret was, well, she was a bit odd, kept to herself. We didn't see much of her, but every so often she'd come out to get her mail, and that was about it. "Did you ever see any children there? Or hear anything strange?" Karen asked, her voice trembling with hope. The man frowned, thinking, "No kids, no. But, come to think of it, there were times when I thought I heard voices coming from inside. Like a kid talking, maybe. I figured it was just the TV or something." Karen's hands felt cold. "Do you remember when that was?" He shrugged. "Years back. Hard to say. But if you're looking for answers, maybe you should talk to old Mrs. Bentley down the street. She used to be close with Margaret back in the day." Karen thanked him and hurried down the street. Mrs. Bentley's house was a little yellow cottage with roses climbing up the front porch. She knocked and was greeted by a small, kind-faced woman who invited her in with a warm smile. Over tea, Karen told her everything: the toy box, the note, and her missing son. Mrs. Bentley listened quietly, her brow furrowed. "Oh dear," she said when Karen finished. "I always knew something wasn't quite right with Margaret. She was a sweet girl once, but after her husband died, she changed, became distant, kept to herself. But I do remember, there were rumors, Rumors?" Karen asked, her voice catching. Mrs. Bentley nodded. "Some folks said they saw a little boy around her house. Just glimpses, peeking out from a window, or playing in the yard. But Margaret always said it was just her nephew visiting. Nobody really pressed her about it." Karen felt a shiver run down her spine. Could that have been Danny? She tried to imagine her little boy stuck in that house, hidden away from the world. It made her stomach twist with fear and anger. She left Mrs. Bentley's house with more questions than answers. That night, she sat in Danny's room, the note on her lap, and she couldn't stop thinking about the possibility that he'd been so close all those years. She didn't sleep much, her mind churning with half-formed theories and memories that wouldn't stop replaying. The next day, she went to the police. She explained everything to Officer Miller, the same man who'd been on the case all those years ago. He listened patiently, his lined face showing both kindness and the weight of unsolved cases he carried. "I remember your boy," he said softly. "We searched every inch of this town back then. But if you think there's something here, we'll look into it." Karen felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you. I can't let this go. Not after finding that note." He promised to dig into the old records and see if there was any connection between Margaret and Danny's disappearance. Karen left the station feeling a little lighter, like maybe she wasn't alone in this after all. The next week was a blur of waiting and worrying. Karen tried to keep busy, sorting through the toys in the box, hoping for more clues. She found a small, chipped marble at the bottom, something she recognized instantly. It had been Danny's favorite. He used to carry it in his pocket everywhere he went. She held it up to the light, her breath catching. Every detail felt like a breadcrumb leading her closer to the truth. At night, she would lie in bed and think about the note. "I'm okay. Don't worry." What did that mean? Had Danny been trying to send her a message all those years ago? And if he was okay back then, what about now? Her dreams were full of shadows and whispers, fragments of memories that didn't quite fit together. One evening, there was a knock on her door. It was Officer Miller, his face serious. "We found something in the old police files," he said. He handed her a faded report, the pages yellowed with age. It was a record of a noise complaint from a neighbor on Oakwood Drive back in 1992. The neighbor reported hearing a child crying in the house, but when the police checked, Margaret said it was just the TV. They hadn't thought much of it at the time. Karen's hands shook as she read the report. This has to be him, she whispered. Officer Miller nodded. It's possible. But after all these years, it's going to be hard to find out exactly what happened. Karen looked up at him, her eyes fierce. I don't care how hard it is. I'm not stopping. My son is out there somewhere, and I'm going to find him. The officer nodded, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. We'll help you, Karen. We'll find the truth. But even as they spoke, Karen knew the road ahead would be long and full of more questions than answers. Each step felt like walking through a fog, unsure of what lay ahead. But for the first time in years, she had a direction, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. She would find out what happened to Danny. She had to. As she sat in the quiet of Danny's room that night, the note resting on her lap, she whispered a promise to her son. I'm coming for you, Danny. No matter what. And in the silence that followed, she could almost hear a whisper back, like a promise carried on the wind. Karen couldn't sleep that night. The shadows in Danny's room seemed to flicker and dance with every breath she took, the note's words echoing in her head like a soft chant. I'm okay. Don't worry. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts tangled in questions she couldn't answer. What if Danny had really been in that house on Oakwood Drive? What if he'd been alive all these years, and she was only just now starting to see the clues he'd left behind? She tried to hold on to that hope, but every heartbeat felt like a drumbeat of fear, reminding her of how little she really knew. The next morning, Karen decided she needed to do more than wait for the police. She pulled out a worn notebook and began jotting down everything she could remember about the day Danny disappeared, every small detail that had once seemed so insignificant. Who had been at the party, what games they played, the neighbors who stopped by. She hoped that by writing it all down, she might see something she'd missed. She called Emily again and asked if she could come over. When Emily arrived, they spread out the notebook, photographs, and the toys from the yard sale across the kitchen table. I keep thinking about that noise complaint from 1992, Karen said, her voice tight. It was a year after Danny disappeared. If he was in that house, why didn't anyone see him? Emily reached over and squeezed her hand. Maybe Margaret was hiding him. Or maybe he wasn't there all the time. We don't know yet, but we're closer than we've ever been. The thought that her son could have been so close yet out of reach for so long sent a wave of nausea through Karen. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. I have to find out what happened in that house. I have to know if he was really there. Emily nodded. Then we start asking questions. Someone must have known more than they let on. They decided to dig deeper into Margaret Collins' past. Karen remembered that Margaret used to go to church at St. Mark's down the road, so she and Emily went to talk to Father Thomas, who had been there for decades. The old church smelled of candle wax and worn wood, and the stained glass cast colorful patterns across the pews. Father Thomas greeted them with a kind smile, though his eyes turned grave when Karen told him why they were there. I remember Margaret, he said slowly, folding his hands in front of him. She was always quiet, always alone after her husband passed. But there were rumors. People said she was not herself in those last years. Karen leaned forward, her heart racing. Did she ever mention a child? Or bring one with her? Father Thomas frowned. No, but I remember once she came to confession, crying. She said she had done something terrible, something she could never forgive herself for. I didn't press her for details, it's not my place. But she was so tormented. I prayed for her, but I don't know what it was she carried. Karen felt a shiver run down her spine. She thanked Father Thomas and left the church, her mind spinning. If Margaret felt guilty, maybe she really did of Danny, she whispered to Emily as they walked back to the car. Emily nodded. But what happened to him? And why didn't he come home if he could? That night, Karen couldn't shake the image of Margaret, haunted by her own secrets. She began to wonder if maybe Margaret hadn't been alone in keeping those secrets. Maybe someone else had known, someone who had looked the other way or helped keep the truth buried. The idea made her skin crawl. In the days that followed, Karen spent hours at the library, poring over old newspapers and town records. She found little snippets about Margaret, an obituary for her husband, a mention of a charity bake sale she'd once hosted. but nothing concrete about a child. Nothing about Danny. It was like he'd vanished from the face of the earth, except for that note and those toys. Meanwhile, Officer Miller was doing his own digging. He called Karen one afternoon with a new lead. "I found an old neighbor of Margaret's who said he saw a boy in the yard once, but he thought it was her nephew. He said the boy looked sad, like he didn't belong there." Karen's heart lurched. That has to be Danny. It has to be. But even as she said it, doubt gnawed at her. What if it wasn't? What if she was chasing shadows? The next week, Karen and Emily decided to visit the estate sale company that had cleaned out Margaret's house. Maybe there were other things, records, papers, left behind. The woman at the company, a brisk, no-nonsense type, was initially reluctant to share details, but when Karen explained about her missing son, the woman softened. "I don't know how much help I can be," she said, "but I remember there were boxes of old papers in the attic. Most of it was junk, old letters, bills, stuff like that. But there was one box, it was locked, and we didn't have the key. We gave it back to the lawyer handling the estate." Karen's pulse quickened. "Do you know how to contact that lawyer?" The woman scribbled down a name and number. "Good luck," she said softly as Karen and Emily left. They wasted no time. The lawyer's office was a cramped space filled with dusty law books and the smell of stale coffee. Mr. Hutchins, a thin, balding man, listened carefully as Karen explained her search. "I do remember that box," he said, adjusting his glasses. "It was an old metal chest, very heavy. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another piece of a dead woman's past. But if you think it might be connected to your son," he trailed off, frowning, "I'll see if it's still in storage." Karen waited in the lobby, her leg bouncing nervously. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, Mr. Hutchins returned, holding a small metal chest. It was battered and rusted, but its weight in his hands made Karen's heart race. "Here it is," he said. "I don't have the key, but maybe you can find a way to open it." Back at home, Karen and Emily sat in the living room, the chest between them. "What if this has answers?" Emily said quietly. Karen nodded, her fingers trembling as she ran them over the cold metal. They tried to pick the lock, but it wouldn't budge. Finally, Emily fetched an old screwdriver from the garage, and together they pried it open. Inside was a collection of papers, old photographs, letters, a few faded postcards. Karen's breath caught as she flipped through them. There were pictures of Margaret and her husband, looking young and in love. Letters from old friends. And then, tucked in the back, a small, battered journal. Karen opened it, her hands shaking. The entries were scrawled in a shaky hand, the words disjointed and haunted. "I can't sleep. The boy cries at night." One entry read. Another. "I tell myself I'm helping him. I'm keeping him safe. But he looks at me like he knows I'm lying." Karen's breath came in short gasps. Emily put a hand on her shoulder, her face pale. This sounds like she was talking about Danny." Karen nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But why? Why would she take him?" She kept reading, desperate for answers. The final entry was dated just a month before Margaret died. "I can't live with it anymore. He deserves to go home. I'm so sorry." Karen's hands fell to her lap. If she was sorry, did she try to send him home? Did she let him go? But if she had, where was he? And why hadn't he come back? Karen felt a chill in her bones. Maybe Margaret had tried to return Danny, but something had stopped her. Or maybe he had left on his own, scared and alone, and never found his way back. The thought of her little boy lost and afraid made her chest ache. The journal was a crack in the darkness, but it didn't give her the answers she needed. It only raised more questions, questions that felt like they were closing in on her, pressing down with every breath. She knew she couldn't stop now. She had to keep going, keep searching, no matter how hard it was. That night, Karen lay awake again, the journal open beside her. She thought of Danny, of his smile, his laugh, the way he used to snuggle up beside her when he was scared. She thought of how brave he must have been, how strong. "I'm coming, Danny," she whispered into the dark. "I promise." And somewhere in that still, silent night, she thought she heard the faintest echo of his voice, calling back to her from the shadows. Karen sat at the kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows across the worn pages of Margaret's journal. Each word she read felt like a whisper from the past, pulling her deeper into a web of secrets and unanswered questions. The entries hinted at a boy, a presence in the house, but never named. The ambiguity gnawed at her, fueling a growing sense of urgency. Wikipedia. Determined to uncover the truth, Karen reached out to Officer Miller, who had been assisting her with the investigation. She shared the journal's contents, hoping it would provide new leads. Miller agreed to revisit the case files, looking for any overlooked connections. Meanwhile, Karen decided to speak with the neighbors who had lived near Margaret during the early 90s. She visited the Thompsons, an elderly couple who had lived next door to Margaret. Mrs. Thompson recalled seeing a young boy in Margaret's backyard occasionally, but she had assumed he was a relative visiting. Karen's heart raced. This could be the first real confirmation that Danny had been there. As Karen delved deeper, she discovered that Margaret had a sister, Lillian, who had passed away a few years prior. Lillian's daughter, Sarah, might hold some answers. Karen managed to track down Sarah, who lived in a nearby town. During their conversation, Sarah mentioned that Margaret had become increasingly reclusive after her husband's death and had distanced herself from the family. She also recalled a time when her mother expressed concern about Margaret's mental state, mentioning that Margaret had spoken of protecting a child from harm. These revelations painted a picture of a woman grappling with grief and possibly mental illness, who might have believed she was rescuing Danny. But the question remained, what had happened to him? Karen's investigation led her to a local historian, Mr. Jenkins, who had documented the town's history extensively. He provided her with old maps and property records, revealing that Margaret's house had a hidden basement not listed in the official blueprints. This discovery sent chills down Karen's spine. Could Danny have been kept there? With Officer Miller's assistance, they obtained a warrant to search the property. The house, now abandoned, stood silent and foreboding. Inside, dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. They found the hidden basement entrance concealed beneath a rug in the living room. The narrow staircase led to a small, windowless room. Inside, they discovered remnants of a child's presence, old toys, a worn blanket, and faded drawings on the walls. Karen's knees buckled as she took in the scene, the reality of her son's captivity sinking in. Among the items, they found a small box containing photographs. One image showed a young boy, around Danny's age at the time of his disappearance, standing in the backyard. His eyes held a sadness that pierced Karen's heart. Another photo depicted Margaret holding the boy, both looking solemn. These images confirmed that Danny had been there, but they raised more questions than answers. As the investigation continued, forensic analysis of the basement revealed no signs of Danny's remains, offering a glimmer of hope that he might have survived. Karen clung to this possibility, her determination unwavering. Officer Miller discovered that Margaret had made several trips to a remote cabin she owned in the woods, a property unknown to most. Karen and Miller decided to visit the cabin, hoping to find more clues. The journey was arduous, the path overgrown and treacherous. Upon arrival, they found the cabin in disrepair, nature reclaiming the structure. Inside, they uncovered more drawings, similar to those in the basement, and a journal belonging to Margaret. The entries detailed her internal struggle, her belief that she was protecting the boy from a world that had failed them. The final entry mentioned taking the boy somewhere safe, but offered no specifics. This revelation led Karen to consider the possibility that Margaret had entrusted Danny to someone else. She revisited the estate sale company, speaking with the employees who had cleared out Margaret's belongings. One worker recalled a man who had shown particular interest in a box of personal items, claiming to be a relative. Karen obtained a description and, with Miller's help, managed to identify the man as Thomas Green, a former social worker. Tracking down Thomas proved challenging, but they eventually located him living in a nearby city. When confronted, Thomas was hesitant to speak but eventually admitted that Margaret had approached him years ago, seeking help for the boy. She claimed he was her nephew, abandoned by his parents. Thomas had placed the boy with a foster family, unaware of his true identity. Unfortunately, due to a clerical error, the boy's records were incomplete, and he had been adopted under a different name. This revelation sent Karen on a new path, searching for adoption records that matched the timeline and circumstances. After weeks of relentless effort, she narrowed down the possibilities to a few individuals. Among them was a young man named David, who bore a striking resemblance to Danny. Karen reached out, arranging a meeting under the pretense of discussing a community project. When they met, Karen was overwhelmed by emotion. David's mannerisms, his smile, it was like seeing a ghost. She struggled to maintain composure, engaging in casual conversation while searching for any sign that he might be her son. As they parted ways, Karen handed him a photograph of Danny, asking if he recognized the boy. David studied the image, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. He admitted that he had no memory of his early childhood, having been adopted at a young age. Karen left the meeting with a mix of hope and uncertainty. DNA testing would provide the definitive answer, but the wait was agonizing. Each day felt like an eternity, the possibility of reunion tantalizingly close yet painfully out of reach. NewYorker.com. As the days passed, Karen found herself reflecting on the journey, the years of grief, the recent discoveries, the people who had helped her along the way. She realized that, regardless of the outcome, she had uncovered truths that had long been buried, bringing light to a dark chapter of her life. The story was far from over, but Karen felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would continue to seek the truth, to find her son, and to heal the wounds of the past. The path ahead was uncertain, but she was no longer walking it alone. And so, the search continued, each step bringing her closer to the answers she so desperately sought. Karen sat in her car outside the small cafe where she had met David just days before. The DNA test results were due any moment, and her heart pounded with anticipation and dread. She clutched her phone, staring at the screen as if willing it to ring. When it finally did, she hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end confirmed what she had feared. The DNA did not match. David was not her son. The disappointment was crushing, but Karen refused to give up. She returned to Officer Miller, who had been her steadfast ally throughout the investigation. Together, they revisited the adoption records, searching for any discrepancies or overlooked details. Their persistence paid off when they discovered a file for a boy named Daniel, adopted around the same time Danny had disappeared. The file contained a photograph of a young boy with familiar features, and Karen's heart skipped a beat. They tracked down the adoptive family, the Harrisons, who lived in a nearby town. Karen and Officer Miller approached them cautiously, explaining the situation and showing them the photograph. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison were shocked but cooperative, agreeing to a DNA test. Their son, now named Michael, was away at college but agreed to meet with Karen. When Karen met Michael, she was struck by his resemblance to Danny. He was polite but reserved, clearly unsettled by the revelations. They spoke at length, sharing stories and memories. Michael admitted to having vague recollections of a different life, flashes of a woman who wasn't his adoptive mother. The DNA test results confirmed what Karen had hoped. Michael was her son, Danny. The reunion was bittersweet. While Karen was overjoyed to have found her son, she was acutely aware of the years they had lost. Michael struggled to reconcile his two identities, feeling torn between the life he had known and the one he had been taken from. They agreed to take things slowly, meeting regularly to rebuild their relationship. As they spent more time together, Karen noticed that Michael seemed troubled. He spoke of recurring nightmares and a sense of unease he couldn't shake. Karen encouraged him to speak with a therapist, hoping it would help him process his experiences. During one session, Michael recalled the name, Dr. Whitmore. The name meant nothing to him, but it sparked something in Karen's memory. She dug through the old case files and found a reference to a Dr. Whitmore, a child psychologist who had worked with Margaret. Karen and Officer Miller visited the clinic where he had practiced, only to learn that he had retired years ago. They managed to track him down to a secluded cabin in the woods. Dr. Whitmore was an elderly man, frail but sharp-minded. He remembered Margaret and the boy she had brought to him. He explained that Margaret had claimed the boy was her nephew, traumatized by the loss of his parents. She had sought therapy for him, but Dr. Whitmore had grown suspicious of her story. Before he could report his concerns, Margaret stopped bringing the boy to sessions. Karen pressed for more details, but Dr. Whitmore insisted he had no further information. As they left, Officer Miller received a call from the lab. The DNA test results were in, and they confirmed that Michael was indeed Danny. Karen was overwhelmed with emotion, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her son. The revelation brought a sense of closure, but also raised new questions. Why had Margaret taken Danny? What had driven her to such an act? Karen and Officer Miller continued their investigation, determined to uncover the truth. They discovered that Margaret had suffered a series of personal tragedies, including the loss of her own child. It appeared that she had projected her grief onto Danny, convincing herself that she was saving him from a neglectful mother. As they delved deeper, they uncovered a network of individuals who had aided Margaret in her deception. Among them was a woman named Evelyn, who had posed as a social worker to facilitate Danny's adoption. Karen confronted Evelyn, demanding answers. Evelyn confessed that she had been manipulated by Margaret, who had presented herself as a concerned aunt seeking a better life for her nephew. The investigation revealed a web of lies and deceit, but also highlighted the resilience of the human spirit. Karen and Danny faced the challenges ahead together, determined to reclaim the years they had lost. Their journey was far from over, but they were no longer alone. Karen stood on the porch of the Harrison home, her hands trembling as she clutched the DNA results. The confirmation that Michael was indeed her long-lost son, Danny, brought a mix of relief and anxiety. Inside, Michael sat on the couch, his expression unreadable. He had grown up with the Harrisons, believing them to be his real parents. The revelation of his true identity had shaken him to the core. Karen entered the room slowly, her eyes meeting Michael's. "I know this is a lot to take in," she said softly, "but I want you to know that I've never stopped looking for you." Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It's just, everything I thought I knew is different now." They spent the evening talking, sharing stories and memories. Karen showed him photos from his childhood, hoping to spark some recollection. Michael listened intently, occasionally asking questions. As the night wore on, a sense of connection began to form between them. The next day, Karen and Michael visited Officer Miller to discuss the next steps. They wanted to understand how Margaret had managed to keep Danny hidden for so long. Miller revealed that Margaret had been part of a small, secretive community that believed in alternative child-rearing practices. They had their own network of homes and schools, making it easy for children to disappear from the system. Karen was stunned. "So she wasn't acting alone?" Miller shook his head. "It appears not. We're still investigating, but it seems there were others involved." As they delved deeper, they discovered that Margaret had connections to a woman named Evelyn, who had posed as a social worker to facilitate Danny's adoption. Evelyn had since disappeared, leaving behind a trail of forged documents and false identities. Determined to find Evelyn, Karen and Miller followed leads that took them across the state. They eventually located her in a remote cabin, living under an assumed name. When confronted, Evelyn admitted to her role in the deception but claimed she had been manipulated by Margaret. "Margaret was persuasive," Evelyn said. "She convinced me that the boy was in danger and needed a safe home." Wikipedia, Karen was furious. "You stole my son and gave him to strangers. How could you?" Evelyn looked remorseful. "I thought I was helping. I see now that I was wrong." With Evelyn's confession, the authorities were able to piece together the full extent of Margaret's network. Several other children had been taken and placed in similar situations. Efforts were made to locate and reunite them with their families. Back home, Karen and Michael continued to rebuild their relationship. They spent time together, sharing meals and attending therapy sessions to process their experiences. Michael struggled with feelings of guilt and confusion, but Karen reassured him that none of it was his fault. One evening, as they were going through old boxes in the attic, Michael found a letter addressed to Karen. It was from Margaret, written shortly before her death. In it, she expressed remorse for her actions and explained that she had truly believed she was saving Danny from a harmful environment. Karen read the letter with mixed emotions. While she couldn't forgive Margaret for what she had done, she appreciated the acknowledgement of wrongdoing. As they continued to sort through the boxes, Michael came across a photograph of himself as a child, standing next to a boy he didn't recognize. He showed it to Karen, who was equally puzzled. "That's not you," she said, examining the photo closely. "But it looks like you." They took the photo to Officer Miller, who conducted a facial recognition analysis. The results were shocking. The boy in the photo was another child who had gone missing around the same time as Danny. Further investigation revealed that Margaret had taken multiple children over the years, each time creating a new identity for them. Karen and Michael were stunned. They realized that their story was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Determined to help, They joined forces with other families affected by Margaret's actions, forming a support group and advocating for changes in the child welfare system. As they worked together, Karen and Michael grew closer, their bond strengthened by their shared experiences. They found solace in each other and in the knowledge that they were making a difference. One day, while attending a conference on child welfare reform, Karen was approached by a woman who introduced herself as Lisa. She claimed to have information about Margaret's network and offered to share it. Karen and Michael agreed to meet with her privately. During their meeting, Lisa revealed that she had been part of Margaret's community but had left years ago. She provided them with documents and records that detailed the extent of the network's activities. Among the files was a list of names, including that of a boy named Daniel. Karen was confused. "But that's Michael's birth name," she said. Lisa looked at her solemnly. "I know. But according to these records, Daniel was placed with the Harrisons, and another boy, your son, was placed elsewhere." Crime reads, Karen's heart sank. "Are you saying Michael isn't my son?" Lisa nodded. "I'm sorry. It appears there was a mix-up in the records." Karen was devastated. She had spent months rebuilding her relationship with Michael, only to discover that he wasn't her biological son. She broke the news to Michael, who was equally shocked and saddened. Despite the revelation, they decided to maintain their bond. They had become family through their shared experiences and the love they had developed for each other. Karen resumed her search for her real son, armed with the new information provided by Lisa. As she continued her quest, Karen remained hopeful. She had found strength in adversity and discovered the power of love and resilience. Her journey was far from over, but she was determined to see it through to the end. Karen sat at her kitchen table, the afternoon light streaming through the window and bathing her in a warm glow. The past few months had been a whirlwind of discoveries and heartbreaks, but she had finally reached a point of quiet determination. The journey to find her real son wasn't over, but she knew she was stronger than ever. Michael came in carrying a box of old photographs and set it down next to her. Despite learning the truth about his identity, he had become a part of her life in a way that felt real. Their connection wasn't based on blood anymore. It was built on trust, compassion, and the shared understanding of how lives can be upended and still find their way back together. "I found some more pictures from that summer trip we took," he said, flipping through the images with a small smile. Karen looked at the photos, memories of laughter and sunsets by the lake. They were bittersweet reminders of what they had shared, even if it wasn't the life she had imagined. "Thank you, Michael," she said softly. "These mean more than you know." "I know we aren't really mother and son by blood," he said, his voice quiet but sure, "but you'll always be my family." Karen reached across the table and squeezed his hand, feeling a deep sense of peace. "You're part of my family too," she said. With the help of Officer Miller, Karen continued to search for her biological son, using the new information Lisa had provided. They tracked down more records and even uncovered a few names of families who might have adopted him, but each lead seemed to end in a dead end. Still, she refused to let go of the hope that one day they would be reunited. In the meantime, she threw herself into supporting the other families affected by Margaret's network. She worked with social workers and advocates to create resources for children who had been taken and for parents who never stopped looking. The community they built was strong and loving, and it gave her a sense of purpose that helped fill the empty spaces in her heart. One evening, she received a call from Lisa. Her voice was urgent but kind, and she told Karen that she'd found a possible lead on her son. "There's a man named James," Lisa said. "He grew up in a small town not far from here, and his birth records match what we know about your son." Karen's breath caught in her throat. It felt like another chance, a new beginning. She arranged to meet James the next day in a nearby park. When she saw him sitting on a bench, her heart skipped a beat. He was older now, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that reminded her so much of the boy she'd lost. As they spoke, she could feel the threads of connection forming, delicate and real. James didn't remember much from his early childhood, but he listened to her stories, and she could see the flickers of recognition in his eyes. After a few meetings, they decided to take a DNA test to be sure. Waiting for the results was excruciating, but this time Karen felt a quiet confidence. When the results came back, confirming that James was her son, she cried tears of relief and joy. She had finally found him. Their reunion was gentle and gradual. Karen didn't want to overwhelm him. and James was patient as they explored their shared history. They talked for hours about what life had been like for each of them, Karen's endless search, and James's memories of a childhood that had always felt incomplete. There were still gaps to fill, but they took it one day at a time. Karen realized that the years they'd lost could never be replaced, but they could build something new together. She invited James to dinner with Michael, and the three of them found a quiet rhythm, learning how to be a family in their own way. There were moments of sadness and uncertainty, but they faced them together, knowing that what mattered most was the love they shared. One afternoon, Karen stood by the window watching James and Michael talk in the garden. The sun was warm, and the gentle hum of laughter drifted through the open window. She felt a profound sense of peace settle in her chest. Life had taken her on a journey she never could have imagined, full of heartbreak and hope, but it had led her here, to this moment of quiet contentment. She thought back to the day at the yard sale when it had all begun. That single, strange discovery had set everything in motion. Looking back, she realized that the story wasn't just about finding her son. It was about finding herself, about understanding the power of love and the resilience of the human spirit. It was about forgiveness and hope, about how even in the darkest moments, there can be light. Karen closed her eyes and let the soft breeze wash over her. She knew there would always be scars, but they were part of the story, proof that they had survived, that they had found each other again. In the end, she understood that family wasn't just about blood. It was about the people who stayed, the people who believed, and the people who never gave up. As the day turned to evening, Karen joined Michael and James in the garden. They shared stories and laughter, and for the first time in years, she felt whole. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over their faces. In that perfect moment, she knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be. And in the quiet that followed, she smiled, grateful for the winding path that had led them home.